than participating as in supporting those sanctions. Yeah. So when third party states actually undercut sanctions, right, it makes those sanctions ineffective. Yeah. So they noted that the international institutions' ability to prevent states from sanctions busting can be a crucial contributor to a sanctioning effort's potential success. Yeah, so basically, if you want to ensure right that a sanction is successful, you need to go after the possible or potential sanctions busting state. Okay, so the 2015 study which they published, right, actually was based on a quantitative study um, that they launched to determine the effectiveness of international organizations in constraining their member states. Yeah. So the unit of study was actually 164 sanctions episodes, and they basically looked at 5 international institutions, namely the Arab League, the ECEU, the Organization of American States, or OAS, Organization of African Unity, or OAU, and the UN. And after looking through and analyzing the data that they got from those 164 sanctions episodes, they found that only the EC or EU and Arab League were capable of preventing their members from becoming extensive trade-based sanctions busters. Right. So they basically these EC, EU, and Arab League were more effective in um, ensuring compliance amongst their member states. And they also noted that there was no evidence that the UN sanctions actually constrained the members from becoming extensive trade-based sanctions busters. So they found that with UN, right, the UN sanctions that are imposed, right, for example, on Iran or Korea, North Korea or whatever, it doesn't actually constrain their members from um, being spoilers. Yeah? So the conclusion here was that not all international institutions contribute to the effectiveness of sanctioning efforts, and especially in preventing spoiler behaviors among their member states. Yeah, and in fact, larger size sanctioning coalitions, such as the UN, are not always effective. Okay, so this is what they said. They said that smaller international institutions can obtain deeper sanctions commitments from their members and more effectively monitor and police those commitments than larger international institutions. As such, the sanctions imposed by small international institutions should be far more effective at preventing their members from becoming trade-based sanctions busters than those imposed by larger sized institutions. Okay, so these were some of the the factors that they basically identified that basically um, stymie the effectiveness of sanctions. So basically, how they define sanctions busters was that these are states that dramatically increase their trade and or foreign assistance with target states after they have been sanctioned. Yeah, so basically, once these sanctions have been put in place, right, these sanctions busters, right, actually instead of decreasing or not even trading with those target states, right, those states that are targeted with sanctions, they actually dramatically increase their trade or even their foreign assistance to those target states after the sanctions. So Early and Spice basically found that sanctions are less likely to succeed when right, the target state's largest pre-sanctions trading partners actually increase trade in the post-sanctions period. Yeah, so if you recall, right, just now we saw, I think at the end of that PBS video, that China was the largest trading partner, right? and the EU was the third largest trading partner of Iran. And you notice that even during the period in time when the US had imposed sanctions on Iran, China still continued to actually trade with Iran because China is actually Iran's largest pre-sanctions trading partner. And then they also found in his in the work that he published in 2011 that the number of third-party states, sanctions are less likely to succeed when the number of third-party states actually step up their sanctions busting trade with the target state. Yeah. So if let's say there's an increase in the number of third-party states, right, that actually um, trade, I mean, yeah, trade with the target state, right, and they actually increase their trade with the target state. That makes sanctions less likely to succeed. So the the authors basically said that you really need to understand the motive behind the reasons why these states actually are spoilers. Yeah, and you'll find that mostly it's driven by commercially motivated firms and traders within those states, those third-party states that actually seek to exploit trading opportunities. So you realize that with sanctions, right, supposedly all trade supposed to, I mean, if let's say the sanctions on trade, all trade supposed to cease, right? But by seizing their trade with all other states, right, there will be, of course, opportunistic firms that would step in and try to fill the void because they want to exploit. They want to basically cash in on that that trading opportunity with the sanction state. So if IGOs or IOs are so ineffective, then why do sanctioning states actually turn to IOs? Mm. So early spies found that basically these sanctioning states, basically the states that want to impose sanctions on the target state, right? They actually want multilateral cooperation for their sanctioning efforts um, because they recognize that that there will be third-party states, right, that could potentially play a role in spoiling their sanctions. Yeah. So they assume basically that these multilateral that if they were to impose a multilateral sanction on the target state, right, getting all the other states involved, all the other member states and the IOs involved in imposing sanctions. So it's not just a unilateral sanction from one state to the target state, but actually it's a pressure of multilateral sanctions, right? Um, that the target state will be facing, right? So they assume that by having these multilateral sanctions, right, it'll be more effective, right? Because it would mean that the target states are facing greater costs from all of these states that are acting uh, in unity, right? In coordinating their trading relations, right, um, with the sanctioning state and imposing the sanctions on the target state. Yeah. So basically, the assumption here is that IOs, right, will actually inhibit spoiler behaviors because the assumption is that IOs, right, because they have rules, right, institutionalized within the IOs, they actually place constraints on the member states' ability to undercut the sanctioning efforts. So they assume that that um, the sanctions, the more no, the would be costlier, right? Because there will be more states involved in imposing sanctions on the target states. So it will be more. The sanctions will be more effective, and that the assumption also is that IOs are all equally effective in preventing spoiler behavior. But of course, that doesn't pan out in reality. Yeah. So there are actually two theories that early and spies actually mentioned in their article. They mentioned spatial theory as well as enforcement theory. Yeah, so spatial theory basically suggests that international institutions actually provide a platform for member states that they will actually coalesce around a united bargaining position, and so they will all basically contribute to the success of that sanctioning effort. Yeah, and then enforcement theory basically points to the enhanced monitoring and enforcement capabilities of international institutions, which make sanctions busting more difficult and costly. Yeah. But and of course, Dresner, right, actually also suggested that international institutions are also helpful in the sense that they can be used to provide side payments to the states, the member states that may suffer as a result of the decreased trade with the target state, right? Or and they also international institutions can also offer reassurances, right, by monitoring and ensuring compliance of members that member states are actually following through on their commitments. Yeah, so that these are the two theories that basically support the assumption that IOs are more effective. If you were to use IOs to impose sanctions on a target state, right, it would be more effective. You know, going the multilateral route than a unilateral one. Okay, so but early and spies basically mentioned, I mean, like I said just now, that size actually matters, right? And basically, this is why they say that size matters. And I mean, they basically the whole point that they were spread the point that they were stressing throughout the article was basically that smaller institutions are more effective, right? And some reasons why they say that is because larger institutions, right, you tend to have members that come from all different backgrounds, and there's greater heterogeneity, right, among the member states. So you would notice that with such huge heterogeneity, right, your member states would be spread across the spectrum, right, as to whether they support or they would, the extent to which they will support or undercut sanctioning efforts, right. They actually would span the whole spectrum. So you may have some that would help, some would that would help the sanction, some that would hinder the sanctions, and some that would remain indifferent to the sanctions. So the broader and more diverse the members are, the shallower would be the agreements that are reached amongst members, because you would find that each of the member states would actually want their interests to be protected, and they would seek to water down, right, some of the commitments that they need to make to the agreements. Yeah. So you'll find that as a result, the agreement that or obligations that emerge are actually quite weak and quite watered down, right? And there will also be very little monitoring and oversight. So unlike what the enforcement theory seems to suggest, right, the monitoring and oversight of such agreements or such sanctions actually very little, right? It's very weak. Um, Yeah, and then early inspires also noted that these large institutions face greater monitoring and enforcement challenges because the resources that they have to devote to monitoring and enforcement do not grow in proportion to the number of member states that join the coalition. So it's not proportionate. The resources that they have is not directly proportionate to the number of member states that they have in their coalition. And then if let's say there's more newer members that join the coalition, the resources are stretched even further, right? And the availability of resources are even more scarce. The larger the organization. So they also find that it is especially challenging, right, for IOs to prevent private sector sanctions busting traders. Yeah, so you find that quite a number of the, I mean, even though the state, may have actually signed on and agreed um, to uphold or to observe the sanctions, right? Within the state, they do have private sector commercial traders that would actually maybe see, be opportunistic and entrepreneurial and seeking out, right, trading opportunities with the sanctioned state. Yeah. And so IOs find it very difficult to, very challenging to prevent these private sector traders, right, from busting the sanctions because they may mask the nature of their transactions by working through middlemen or finding some creative way to, finance those transactions so that it doesn't go through banks and it's not trackable. As you cannot monitor, you cannot track it, or they may find some ways to work around the sanctions, right, by finding some neutral ground to trade, right, to do their trade. So, um, so as a result, you find that the member state also would. I mean, it's there's a greater incentive, right, for these private sector traders, right, to violate sanctions when the organization is large, because they know that when the organization is large, it's very difficult for the organization to actually monitor and enforce. Yeah, so they would, possibly slip through the cracks. Yeah. So you also find that implementation, monitoring, and enforcement of sanctions tend to occur primarily at the national level. In fact, member states are supposed to self-report. That's why I put there self-monitoring. Yeah, because IOs basically depend on their member states to basically report on their activities, and of course, member states, right, may actually, not report or may not report openly or transparently. Yeah. So, and now, of course, partner governments, right? Some of the member states may be unwilling also to enforce their sanctions obligations on their citizens, right? Because they may require, right, not just the citizens, but the private sector, right, commercial firms and all that, because they may actually require their support, right, for their political um, longevity and all. So, and then you find that IOs can do little to punish the perpetrators. Okay, then you notice that also, remember just now Dressner had mentioned that, IOs could actually do side payments to compensate those, member states that may be adversely affected by the sanctions on the target state, right? But early and spies found that the ability to compensate those members, right, which would supposedly prevent them from backsliding, actually decreases the larger the organization, because the organization would not have sufficient resources to basically compensate those members. Yeah. So, one of the reasons why, right, third party states may backslide or what do you call it, be a spoiler of sanctions, is because, like we mentioned just now, right, third party state leaders often have to balance between the external pressures to cooperate with sanctions, right, versus their constituents' interests in undercutting them. And if now, when it comes to, domestic politics versus international, the constituents, right, domestic um, uh, uh, politics usually win out. Yeah, the constituents' commercial interests usually win out. Yeah. And then, of course, you'll find that when it comes to um, compensating, right, adversely affected members, they the IOs may not have the required resources. So, for example, early and spies actually quoted the example of 21 countries who had petitioned for compensation when UN imposed sanctions on Iraq. basically between 1990 and 2003. Yeah, but the compensation that they were asking for actually far outstripped the UN's available resources. So subsequently, all 21 states basically joined in a letter to UNSC, basically to register their unhappiness with the lack of response from the UN, and also basically to express that they were not going to um, comply. Okay, so let's take a look at this video about how North Korea was evading sanctions.
North Korea has been called out for breaking UN sanctions. They've been imposed to pressure Kim Jong-un's government over its nuclear weapons program. But North Korea has been finding ways to trade key resources such as coal and oil.
We continue to see illegal imports of additional refined petroleum using ship-to-ship transfers, which are clearly prohibited under the UN resolution. We must all be accountable for cutting off North Korea's illegal coal exports, which provide funds that go directly to its WMD programs.
So, how is North Korea evading sanctions? A lot of this is happening out at sea, and it requires foreign partners willing to trade illegally. A UN report says there's been a big increase in transfers of petroleum products and coal between foreign tankers and North Korean ships. This enables North Korea to effectively import these resources restricted under international sanctions. More than 20 North Korean ships have already been blacklisted by the UN for smuggling fuel. Ships conceal their activities by turning off tracking systems or masking the vessel's true identity. North Korea has also been observed shipping weapons. In 2016, 30,000 rocket-propelled grenades were found bound for the Suez Canal. The ship sailed under a Cambodian flag, but was crewed by North Koreans. The consignment was falsely labelled assembly parts for underwater pumps. Now the US and others want to expose the companies involved in sanctions violations. But North Korea says it can withstand pressure from the international community.
The perception that sanctions can bring us on our knees is a pipe dream of the people who are ignorant about us.
So, can the impact of these sanctions be measured? It's estimated that sanctions imposed in 2017 cost North Korea $1 billion in lost revenue. But the UN has estimated that North Korea earned $200 million from illegal trading, although others put the actual amount much higher. Talks with North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un have opened up the possibility of lifting sanctions in the future, in return for progress in reaching a deal to end the country's nuclear ambitions. But for now, North Korea continues to seek ways to survive under tough international sanctions.
Okay, so that basically shows you how, right, North Korea was was able to circumvent those sanctions. Yeah. Okay, let's go back to complex interdependence as a concept to understand, to look at TNAs, yeah, and the relationship with state actors. Okay, so Rogerson, which is the reading the article that was assigned, right, for this topic. Basically, he says that the concept of complex interdependence actually provides a clearer and more appropriate understanding of international relations, especially in an information age. And one of the reasons why he says that it is far superior also is because it actually allows you to synthesize all the different alternative explanations, right, that has been used to um, try to understand the situation of interdependence between states. For example, world systems theory, structural imperialism, globalization and integration. Right, you can synthesize all of these into a cohesive whole under complex interdependence. Yeah, so it also, one of the things that complex interdependence as a concept does is it actually moves away from looking at or focusing on the traditional areas of study of IR, such as the state and the military. You know. So, and of course, you must remember that this is also a concept that was developed by NYE, and NYE was actually all about soft power. So it basically brings in, I mean, soft power is also about communication, about information, about persuasion, using information to persuade. Okay, so this is how Rogerson basically looks at how we can understand, why is it complex interdependence as a concept is actually, helps to unite, helps to pull together all these alternative explanations and to synthesize them within this framework. So basically, complex interdependence actually doesn't focus on just one actor or several state actors, right? It actually points to a multiple number of actors that are basically interacting. And so, as a result of the interaction, they form reciprocal relations and, and in, increases interdependence between them. So the emphasis, this complex interdependence actually places emphasis on non-state actors. And then you also see that it talks about the multiple channels through which these actors can interact in the system. So this could actually be extended. I mean, it can be applicable to studying, right, globalization. And then complex interdependence also points to the fact that issues, right, the hierarchy of issues can change, right. It it could be inverted. Some issues can come to the fore more and then be backgrounded, at a certain time. So it talks about the fluidity of the issues and not a rigid hierarchy. And then it also basically shifts the focus from military um, and the use of military force in interactions. So looking more at economic, more at cultural interactions. So this is how Rogerson sees complex interdependence as being a better concept for explaining what what we observe in our world today. And how foreign policy is also being buffeted by all the different um, forces, right? Like globalization and uh, and the broadening of regimes, right? Okay. In relation to complex interdependence, there's also the concept of sensitivity and vulnerability, which we also mentioned last week. I just realized when I was looking through Rogerson that I should have also introduced Rogerson last week. Because we did mention sensitivity and vulnerability, but sort of as a passing mention. But basically, Rogerson looks at how Keohane and Nye defines sensitivity. So basically, sensitivity is the degree of responsiveness within a policy framework of how quickly changes in one country can bring costly changes in another. So if a state is less sensitive to change, it will be able to basically retain its position, and usually it's a dominant position, and it's able to ensure the status quo. Right? If a state is more sensitive, right, it will be forced to adjust and adapt its decision making more frequently, and hence you would see more reactive sorts of foreign policy coming out of the state. So vulnerability is actually looking at the relative availability and costliness of the alternatives that various actors face. So if a state is less vulnerable, it would be able to keep control. Um, it would be able to basically control its environment. It would be able to change, make changes to address those issues. If a state is more vulnerable, it will increasingly find it difficult to find timely and efficient solutions to the problematic issues. Okay, so this is the table that Rogerson drew up, right? To it's like a matrix, right? To look at the combinations of sensitivity and vulnerability within the state. Yeah, so basically he looks. I mean, the table looks at how to recognize relative sensitivity and vulnerability. Now, if you were to look at this, how would you classify, say, a country like Singapore? Where would you put it? In which of the four boxes? Any idea? Singapore. Where would you put it? In which of the four boxes? Which of the four combinations? Yes, top left, right? You would think that it would be sensitive and vulnerable, right? Because you're basically we are an open economy, right? And we are a lot of our external environment is actually um, we cannot shape our external environment, right? So we are actually sensitive. We are also vulnerable. Yeah. What about the U.S.? And what about North Korea and Iran and EU? Or do you think that, I mean, can you find examples for each of the boxes? Bottom right, US. Top right, North Korea. Insensitive and insensitive and invulnerable for China. Um, yeah, I was actually wondering whether China can be considered invulnerable and insensitive, or would you see it as invulnerable and sensitive? Because even US also, I'm not sure. I mean, right now it seems like it is the insensitive, invulnerable, perfectly hegemonic, imperialistic, right? Not affected by what the choices that others make, right? And it can impose. It's almost unilateral, right? It can mostly um, behave very unilaterally. So, okay, insensitive and vulnerable, right? Cut off from others by choice, but sometimes forced to react to globalization processes. That would be, I guess, like some of you said, North Korea, maybe Iran, right? More of the hermit states, I would think. Yeah. Um, But the question is, what about the bottom left? Sensitive and vulnerable. Any idea? Germany, Japan. Yeah, possibly. Could be. Germany, Japan. Uh, so I guess you would see them as major powers, right? Um, maybe major powers would basically fit into that corner. So China, you think it's more insensitive and vulnerable, or would it be sensitive and vulnerable? Okay, I guess y'all can think about that, huh? Because I mean, it really depends, I guess, on how you. Okay, China probably the same as the U.S. Insensitive and vulnerable. Yeah, that's why I said it's a bit difficult to categorize China. Yeah, because it's not. I wouldn't say that's I don't think it's insensitive to what's going on right now, right, with regard to um, technology and all that. I mean, the 5G technology with regard to the US actually scrutinizing everything that the Chinese companies are doing. Okay, so Gerald feels that they do have alternatives and in implementing like BRI and what they're doing in SCS. Okay, the SCS is a bit, I don't know. Yeah, SCS may be a little bit, they may actually have be a bit sensitive there, right? The they might have relatively more sensitivity in that situation. The BRI maybe not, but you find that I mean I don't know. There have been reports saying that they have they may have problems right with some of the places right. Some of the countries defaulting and not having enough. Um, I don't know whether they have enough to finance the completion of the BRI or not, that kind of thing. But um, and then of course they are also facing pressure from the B3W, right? Build Back Better, right? Project from the G7. So, but maybe that's not immediate. Then there's AUKUS as well, and there's the Quad as well, right? That's focused on the Indo-Pacific. Plus, you have UK coming in with its Navy force and all that. So difficult to say. Right? Okay, so when we look at interdependence, right, Keohane and NYE basically looks at it as the state is actually lying between mutual dependence, where you have symmetrical relationship between the states, right? Equal, basically equal. They're all on equal footing, right? Mutual dependence, and then on the other end is the imperialism, which is asymmetric relationship with the one state being a dominant state that's able to exercise its and impose its will on the other states that are dependent on it. You know? So asymmetry and imbalance basically will indicate that um, the dominant state has the potential for and relative influence over participants. You know? So that would also suggest that in the information age, right, you may not want to use military force to, coerce. You may want to use persuasion instead. So that would suggest that the dominant state would have an advantage in encouraging and persuading others to act according to its desires. So nice soft power comes in here. Okay, globalization, states and non-state actors. So this is actually Bauman and Stengel, another article that I had asked you all to read as well. Um, you find that with globalization, it's become increasingly apparent that the states are no longer omnipotent, and that state authority is also on the decline, right? But at the same time, concurrently, you find that as the states decline, and then you talk about the the fading of the states, right? Um, the what do you call it? The lowering of state borders, right? Um, you find that non-state actors are also at the same time making their presence felt. And so, non-state actors start to, like we mentioned, right, perform regulatory functions, right, such as formulating rules, rule monitoring, and enforcement. So, in other words, non-state actors start to get involved in governance, right, and these governance arrangements actually um, show that that basically there's been a transfer of authority from states to non-state actors. Yeah, so um, as a result, you find that non-state actors have actually become autonomous rival actors to the state. They can basically there are two they actually influence foreign policy in two ways. Yeah, they are autonomous rival actors to the state, where they actually influence states' foreign policy indirectly by unintentionally hampering or facilitating states' actions. And they could raise coordination challenges as a result. So they become increasingly involved in both the policy making and the decision making process. Um, and then there's also what Bauman and Stengel calls hybrid foreign policy making, where non-state actors are actually brought in as a partner to share decision-making authority with states on foreign policy. This usually happens in the implementation stage, although some of them may be involved in the decision-making stage. So Bauman and Stengel has their own taxonomy of state and non-state actors, right? They talk about four principal actors: the state actor, international actor, private actor, and the transnational actor. So these are basically the next page is really how they define these four different actors. So state actors would be bureaucratic agencies, ministries, local, state, and national law enforcement agencies, and armed forces. And these are basically entities under public law. And they have legal authority, right, limited to a specific national territory. So they are limited by the territory that they have. They are able to exert their authority over. International actors are entities with public legal form that exercise transboundary authority. So these would be international government organizations, for example, right? Bretton Woods institutions, the EU, intergovernmental and interbureaucratic networks, right? So it's not really the organizations themselves, but the networks between individual actors, right? Um, that represent their states in the international government organizations that share information and engage in informal decision making. Then you have private actors, which are non-state actors, um, which have their authority limited to the territory of a single nation state. So you would also put in this category ethnic interest lobby groups, maybe even TNEs, right? Um, then you have transnational actors, where you have entities under private law that exert authority across borders. These would be the transnational networks of NGOs, right? Red Cross, Catholic Church, etc. So, oh gee, I'm gonna have to reproduce this again. Let me just show you the examples from the PowerPoint slide instead. Uh, okay. So this is basically examples that's found also in Bauman and Stengel, right? Page 496. Right? Examples of how non-state actors are involved in foreign policy decision making. So there's basically five stages, right? From problem representation all the way down to evaluation of the policy outcome. Yeah. So basically, these NSAs are actually involved in in various capacities in all these different stages. Yeah. But you'll find mostly um, implementation is where non-state actors are given the most significant leeway, right, to make decisions and to implement, right, the policies as they see fit. Yeah, so this is where they are most able to exert their greatest influence on foreign policy, and this happens usually in conflict-driven um, societies because, as you know, right, there's that the principle of non-intervention, right, that governs international organizations and governs international relations. And so instead of states going into um, conflict areas, conflict zones, usually you'll find that NGOs are the ones that are active in those conflict zones because they are there as uh, more or less, right, um, at the instructions of the IGOs or um, the states themselves. Yeah. So you'll find that conflict prevention NGOs, right, they would be active, right, in the implementation of um, humanitarian policies, right, humanitarian distribution of humanitarian aid, etc., right. um, and also that would also be during sometimes you may find private military companies also coming in to try to keep the peace, to keep the law and order in those conflict zones rather than um, deploying state related military to those countries. Okay, so this is basically in Bauman and Stengel, so you can take a look um, at that reading. But it's mostly the first couple of pages of Bauman and Stengel that you really need to concentrate on to read. Yeah, the later pages you don't really. I mean, you can read it for knowledge, right? But it's not really pertinent to this part of it. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's it for today. Yeah, I'm sorry I took so long to put these slides up, but I was trying to ensure that I was able to make sense of the slides in the and being able to synthesize all the different articles that were assigned for today. Yeah, but I think there's still. I mean, I can still actually rearrange some of the slides because I noticed that it doesn't really uh, the flow isn't really that great. Okay, so if you can go and take a look, read through Christopher Hill, right, and Rogerson. Rogerson actually talks a lot on um, information, the information age and all that. But I think what you need to extract from there is the fact that complex interdependence, which is a concept that um, Keohane and Nine actually developed in the 1990s to try to capture the the impact of digital technology, the spread of information, etc. Right, and the impact on um, of the spread of information on foreign policy making, on international organizations, etc. Um, that really is the main point, right, of Rogerson, to show that it is a far better concept to for us to understand what's going on, right, in foreign policy making. Okay. Okay, I'll try. I'll try and get. Yeah, I'll try and get it updated. Um, and see if I can fit in more information in there. Yeah. All right, but if you can also please read through the reference text. Yeah. Like I said, Bauman and Stengel, probably the first couple of pages only, and you'll notice there's actually a pre-pub um, research uh, article, right? So that's why it's actually in more or less MS Word, but it does have the page numbers where these that it does actually incorporate the original page numbers that it will be printed as, right, when it's printed in the scholarly journal. So I went with that number, the page number, right, of the scholarly journal rather than the Word document. Okay. So Early and Spice is I mean, you can read the whole thing. Um, yeah. And then Alden and Amran is actually looking at globalization, which maybe it may be something that you may want to look at if you're interested in tackling questions on globalization. But it's just looking at the three theories of globalization, yeah, and the differences between them. Yeah, so I didn't summarize it because I thought, I mean, it's something that you probably can read through and understand yourself. Yeah. So they talk about hyperglobalists and all that. All right, so that's it for today. Thank you all for coming. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Sorry about the rush. Yeah. Alrighty. I'll see some of you later. And for those of you whom I won't see, have a good end to the week and a good weekend. No rush to make the updates. Okay. No rush to make uploads. Okay. Yeah, right. Okay. I'll see you guys in a bit.